Hello and welcome back to this reading from my book, The Seed of Yggdrasill by Maria Kvile. That's me. And we have now reached chapter 11, which is about the trials of Thor, the son of Earth. And it appears that these chapters here are mainly based on a transcript from some of my YouTube videos. So going back more than a decade. So it's going to be interesting to see what I thought back then. And we begin. 11.1 Thor in Hårbardsljod. Hårbardsljod, that's a poem about Thor trying to get across a river in order to get back to the gods. And he is stopped by a mysterious ferryman called Hårbardur, which happens to be a kenning for a heiti, an Odin's heiti, which means a nickname for Odin, meaning long beard. And this long beard, Odin in disguise, is testing his son for his worthiness. So this is dedicated to Thor, the god of thunder, lightning and protection. Earlier I talked about how the Thor mythology may reflect some ancient knowledge about electricity and the electromagnetic sphere around the earth. And this I went through in chapter 2.8. Now I am going to discuss a different aspect of Thor lore. According to Snorri, Thor was foremost among the gods after Odin, and he was the son of Odin with Jordr, the earth goddess. Several Edda poems refer to Thor as the son of Odin, as well as the son of earth, so this was probably how people looked upon it during the Viking Age. Not only Edda poems, but also skaldic poetry, which is older and goes really back to the pagan era for sure. And also here, Thor is often referred to both as the son of Earth and as the son of Odin. So, however, a different and probably earlier version of this exists, in which Thor is the ancestor and the original god of the Aesir, while Odin is a human descendant. It is impossible to say which version is correct, because both versions would have been correct to those who believed in either. But that Thor is the older god is historically true. He is a European version of the Indian god Indra, who was worshipped in India at least 5,000 years ago. Okay, a version, at least he is related to, very clearly related to an Vedic god, Indra, who was worshipped in India at least 5,000 years ago. The Thundergod was the most prominent deity of the first Indo-European invaders in Northern Europe, and 2,000 years ago a Roman writer told us that the German tribes all believed that they were descended from the earth goddess and her son, which in this Roman writer, that would be Tacitus, I guess. Well, actually he mentions Tuisto, not Thor, but Tuisto is apparently a logical, etymological equivalent of Thor, meaning thunder. Now, he was the firstborn of Mother Earth, and thus the big brother of all human beings, since all of us are descended also from Mother Earth. And he was an ancestor, at least to the Aesir gods, including Odin. His popularity during the Viking Age was immense. At the Temple of Uppsala in Sweden, he took up the central space and was flanked by Odin and Freyr. In Iceland, too, he was the most popular god, something which is reflected in the Prose Edda written by Snorri about 1225 AD, more than 200 years after the conversion to Christianity. No pagan god receives more attention in the Prose Edda than Thor does, which does not actually tell us anything else than that this lore was the part of the Norse pagan lore that was most easily remembered by the general Christian public of the Middle Ages, probably due to the high action level of his stories. Thor lore is very entertaining and easily remembered. His mythology was the ancient equivalent of modern action movies, the James Bond, Indiana Jones or Bruce Willis type of movies, at least on the surface. Now I am going to take a peek under the surface and look towards the hidden structures of initiation and messages of a spiritual quest that can be drawn from the lore of Thor. And I will focus mainly on the Poetic Edda as a source, because this is the oldest source we have to a lot of Thor lore. The Poetic Edda does not give Thor the same overwhelming, dominating space as Snorri does. Out of 34 Edda poems, only 3 are dedicated to the Thundergod, although he is of course mentioned in a couple of other poems. So today I will put these 3 together and look at the story they tell as a whole. I will be using Snorri's Edda only in the manner it was meant to be used, which is to explain the metaphors of the Edda poems. It is my conviction that the Poetic Edda represents not the totality of the Norse pagan world, but rather represents a particular tradition with a particular message. And in this tradition, Thor is not taken as seriously as he probably was by the common man and worshipper. He is actually ridiculed a lot. Why? Because if you look beyond the awe-inspiring concept of Thor, the mighty thunder god and our protector and ancestor or big brother, so to speak, if you look past the possible connection between Thor and ancient science and to the metaphorical spiritual message level, Thor represents something metaphorically. He represents us, the human species, especially the males. His mother, the earth, was considered the ancestral mother of all humans, and Thor is her firstborn son. He is the archetypical man in the Indo-European tradition. His character is in every respect the ideal Indo-European or Viking Age peasant warrior. Brute strength and courage is the ideal. Intelligence, on the other hand, is not particularly emphasized. Now, imagine you are a poet, a highly educated person, a sensitive, thinking person, initiated into great spiritual mysteries, living in a world dominated by, well, Thors. I think I can relate to how frustrating that sometimes would be. But that was what a Viking Age poet had to relate to on an everyday basis. A lot of Thor types. Now, how to make use of this experience? How to employ the Thor character in a poetic tradition that requires parables and allegories to convey spiritual truths? To the Norse poet, Thor is a fantastic material. How to make this simple-minded and rather uneducated warrior into a learning initiate. Let us take the first Thor poem of the Edda, Hårbardsljod, the Song of Longbeard. This poem is a perfect example of Edda Thor bashing. The mighty god is completely ridiculed as a simple-minded brute. Many scholars have thought that this poem must be reflecting the arguments between those who primarily worshipped Odin and those who primarily worshipped Thor. Odin stands out as the god of smart noblemen, while Thor is the god of ignorant peasants. I do not believe that it is that simple, and I am uncertain about whether anyone living in pagan times would dare to offend each other's gods that much. Remember that they believed in all of them. Even the poet would probably pray to Thor for protection. I think we should look more closely at this poem and reconsider its metaphorical nature. The poem begins with a dilemma. Thor wants to get into Åsgardr, the land of the gods, and he stands by a river, needing the ferryman, the so-called ferryman, to take him across into the lands of Odin, as it is said. The ferryman is Odin, but Thor does not recognize this, and stupidly enough believes that the old god when he says that he is called Longbeard. This is a little hint to the reader or to the listener to the poem. You need to understand that one character may turn up with new names and new shapes in all the stories, but it is easy to be fooled if you are blind, like Thor is in this poem. Another thing we have to ask ourselves is why Thor is not just crossing the rainbow bridge like all the other gods do when they move between worlds. The answer lies with Snorri, who says that Thor cannot use the rainbow bridge like all the other gods because he is too heavy. He has to cross the river like a mortal. So let us just stop there at the bridge. The rainbow bridge is the bridge between the different dimensions of the cosmos. It has names. One of the names is Bifrost, which means shivering voice or vibrating voice. Okay, I wrote that, I thought that 10 years ago, but it is possible that the rust here actually means bridge, just or path. So a shivering path or a vibrating path, a way, a bridge. But it shivers and it vibrates. That's the most important thing. Another name of the rainbow bridge is Biflind, which means soft vibration. From bifa, to shiver or to vibrate, and lind, which means soft. So this bridge between the worlds, this bridge that leads to the world of the gods, the rainbow bridge, it has a vibration, and it has a soft vibration. And obviously, Thor, Snorri explains that he is too heavy, so he doesn't have a soft vibration, and thus he cannot cross the rainbow bridge. That's why he has to take the route that mortals do, namely across the river. So remember that poetically, Thor represents human beings, especially male human beings, and just like us mortals, he has to cross the river of death to get to the other side. Thor tries to make the ferryman do his job and take him into the spirit realm or to the divine realm, but to his surprise, the ferryman refuses. Thor's immediate reaction is typical of Thor, stupid and simple. He rages, he becomes furious and demanding, he feels entitled. He threatens and he boasts about his grand, heroic deeds, only to experience, probably for the first time in his life, that his listener is not in the least impressed. The ferryman seems to just point out the stupidities in Thor's actions. Thor starts to ask the ferryman what he did then, since he is not impressed by Thor's heroic deeds, and the ferryman, which is Odin in disguise, replies. Var ekk med fjøl vari, fim veter alla, I Yggdrasill algrön heiter, vega verdar knattom, och valfälla, margs att freista, mans att kosta. I was with the very wise one, Fjölvari, very much alert. Fjöl is connected to the term fjölkyngi, great knowledge, which has to do with magic and Seiðr and poetry and all the art that Odin mastered, as I have talked about in the Fjölkyngi series here on Patreon. So he was. So Odin in disguise replies that while Thor had done all these heroic deeds that did not impress him, he was with Fjølvari, the very alert one. And he was there for 5 winters on that island which is called Evergreen. We fought men there and fell many of the chosen. We tried many things and we met some women. So the mention of women immediately catches Thor's attention. He asks how the girls had behaved, and Odin replied, Sparkar åttuver koner, F oss at spå dem yrde. Sorry, I'll read again. Sparkar åttuver koner, F oss at spakom yrde. Horskar åttuver koner, F oss hållar veri. Veror sandi sima undu, okkor dali djupom grundum gråfo. Vard ek veim ein öllum efri at rådom. Vilda ek, jo, vein systrom sjau. Ek hafta ek ged, deirar alt og gaman. Vad vant du, då medan, Thor? So Odin replies about these women. The women would have been lively had they only been docile with us. The women would have been wise had they only been benevolent towards us. They spun threads out of the sand. They dug the ground out of the valleys. I was the one who prevailed and who ruled them. I rested with the 7 sisters. I had all their love and their pleasure. What did you do then, Thor? So this needs some clarifications. The girls, the 7 sisters, are obviously not ordinary women. The reference to spinning threads indicates that they are Norns, fate goddesses, and the fact that they are digging valleys also indicates that they are giantesses, because giantesses were the original shapers of the earth, as it is said in another Edda poem, the Grøttasonger, where giantesses shape the earth by hurling boulders from within the earth and digging out valleys and such. Now, if you have seen my previous videos on initiation, well, this is a transcript, so it refers to earlier videos in that Hidden Knowledge series on YouTube. But also it refers to many of the chapters in this book, as we have seen. I have had chapters about an initiation here. You may guess what this means. While Thor was doing all these heroic deeds, Odin had gone to a very interesting place where he learned something from someone who was very, very, very alert or wise. He went to this island that is Evergreen, where he finds people who are dead already because Val. He was fighting with the Val. So he's obviously in a sort of world of immortality reminiscent of Valhall. And there he met some very interesting women who could spin threads out of sand and dig the grounds out of valleys, and who would have been very benevolent and good and wise for Odin if only they had been more compliant. But they were not. However, even if they were not, Odin was the one who managed in the end to rule all of them and to rest with the 7 sisters and have all their love and pleasure. So Odin encountered these primeval female forces, the Fates, and despite their wild nature and lack of docility, he managed to trick them into loving him. It is a metaphor. Thor doesn't really understand this and feebly continues boasting about his manly deeds, getting more and more frustrated by the fact that the ferryman remains completely unimpressed. Again, let us stop for a moment to consider what this means. Odin is the spirit, and he is the spirit of that realm which Thor is seeking to enter, the realm of the gods. And the message here is that even if Thor gains mundane popularity through his strength and abilities as a warrior, this will take him nowhere spiritually. No matter how much he flexes his muscles and displays his manliness and boasts about his great deeds, spirit doesn't care. Spirit cares about other things, and after having endured a little more of Thor's self-important ramblings on about his own greatness, the ferryman turned to focus back towards the supernatural women. Odin says in stanza 30, Ek var auster, och vid einhverja domdak, lek ek vid ena linhvito, och lönthing hadak, gladdak ena gullbjörtu, gamni mer undi. I was to the east, and east is a reference to the giant world, and I made love to someone. I made love to the linen white woman, or the linen white or linen bright woman. In secret I met her, and I made this golden fair woman happy, and she allowed me pleasure. So, according to the interpretations I have been presented with by others than myself, this is supposedly about a bragging contest between the two gods, where Thor brags about his warrior abilities and Odin brags about his seduction abilities. But that interpretation is to disregard the allegorical nature of the myth. We have to ask, who is the linen bright woman? Well, first of all, she lives in the east, like Menglöd in the Fjördsvindsmål. In the Norse cosmos, the east is the direction of the giants, just as south is the direction of the gods, and the north is the direction of Hel. This means that the linen bright woman is a giantess or a maiden living among giants. So if you have paid attention to the earlier chapters, you may find this familiar. Not only is she a giantess, but she is also associated with linen, which connects her to the Norns and to the Valkyrier and to destiny, to fate. And she is described as bright and golden, which is the formula used to describe the consecrating maiden with the mead in all the initiation stories throughout the Edda. To confirm this interpretation, we need only look at the next stanzas in the poem where Thor gets confused and asks if the girls were nice, and the ferryman, Odin, replies angrily. Lids dins var ek da þurfi Thor, at ek helda þeir eina línvít og mei. And Thor replies, Ek munda þeir þó that veita, ef ek vidrof komum. So Odin says, I had been in need of your assistance, Thor, if I was to keep the linen bright woman, or the maiden. And Thor replies, I would have helped you with that if I had only been there. So, is this not an odd exchange? It gets even more odd because Odin asks, What vant du då, Medan, Thor? What did you do then, Thor? Yes, what did Thor do when he was supposed to help Odin marry the linen bright maiden? Well, Thor replies, Bruder berserkja, bardaki läser Ver hoftu värst unnet, välta tjod alla. Berserker brides I battled with at the wind-shielded island. They were worse than anything. They made all the people go wild. And Odin said, Kleki vant du da, Thor, du og konum barder. That was shame you won there, Thor, when you beat up women. And Thor exclaims, But, Varginjur that voru, en varla konor, skeldu skip mitt, ek skorthat haftak, ögdumer jarnvirki, en elto chalfa. She-wargs they were not she-wolves, they were not women, they broke my ship that I had built with such care. They threatened me with iron bars, and they chased away Chalfi, my servant. So, In truth, the ladies of the wind-shielded island are not, of course, actual women. Their island is the island of immortality, where gods and elves will meet to drink the precious mead and recapitulate the history of the world. The women of that island are the daughters of Seiðr, the mothers of the universe, the golden lights of the gods, the Valkyria followers of the fates of men, and yet, to the ignorant, they are nothing but a threat to the known world and to the limited mind. Now I'm going to explain what I am convinced that this means. While Thor, in this poem, as in many others, represents the mentality of a human, a typical human, and especially a human male, in this poem Odin represents, as in many others, the spirit, and in this case Thor's spirit, the divine spirit part of the man Thor. We know the importance of waking up the bright fate sleeping within during initiation. The spirit of any human has already known the bright fate goddess, but could not keep her, because the Thor human was not there. Thor was not there, that's why he couldn't help. The mentality, the mind, was not present when the spirit discovered the linen bright maiden. So instead of being in the place of spirit, our average human representative, especially our average male representative, was out battering women. Sounds familiar? Now, as Thor says in his defense, these women were not really women. First of all, they were from the wind-shielded island, in Old Norse, Hleesøy. And the wind-shielded island is, as we have talked about before, a metaphor for the island of immortality, because wind is a metaphor for death and mortality. So what is wind-shielded is shielded from death. On this land of the immortals lives the giant Seiðr, who is married to Ron, and their 9 daughters, who may be seen as the mothers of the present universe. In another version, the father of these 9 daughters is Njörður, the god of wind and waves. And this sort of indicates a connection between the 9 giantesses and Freyja, Njörður's daughter, the one who is many. One Edda poem, the Oddrunargrótur, clearly identifies the same island of immortality as the home of the 9 original Valkyriur, identifying the island thus with Valland and Valhalla, and it is the place where they spin fates. As I have said before, the division between giantesses, Norns and Valkyriur is not as clear-cut as is commonly believed. Also, this ocean is situated below the World Tree, which is the same ocean from which the Norns emerge. This is just one of countless so-called confusions in the Edda, which is, to my mind, not confusions at all, but proves the fact that all the female forces are connected and may identify with each other. The point here is that the women that Thor tries to fight are primeval forces connected to fate, and they are not being nice to him. They are she-wolves, representing the destructive face of fate. Wolves, in the metaphors of the Old Norse poets, always indicate either greed and destruction or mortality and death. When Thor tries to get to the land of immortality, just like he is trying now without much luck, when he gets there, he is tested by giantesses, Norns or Valkyriur, female forces who have existed before this universe was born. They are the unknown. They are the real power in this universe. Even the gods have to bow down to fate. But Thor recognizes no power besides his own manly heroism. The wolf skin that the Fates wear when meeting Thor indicates that Thor, like all human beings, is struggling with the fate of mortality and greed. And when they attack his ship, the ship that he has made so carefully, and chasing away his servant, Tjalfi. Well, do you know what Tjalfi means? His name means holding something together or making something come together. So these mind-blowing ladies literally, disturb the holding together of Thor's mind. They challenge his ship, metaphorical ship, that he has made so much effort to build his paradigm of understanding. What is known to him, and they knock it over, and he, representing the average man, is too stupid to react with anything but rage and getting nowhere in the spirit world. In the end of this poem, Odin says to Thor that his wife, Sif, has a lover and that his mother, the earth, is dying. Thor takes all this as an insult and is getting angrier and angrier, while Odin remains calm and repeats that this is in fact the case. Now we have to ask ourselves what Sif represents. Her name simply means female relative, which might bring the fylgir to mind, the followers that guide the individual and who spin our fates, probably. Some may be the souls of dead female relatives, others more closely linked to the individual actual soul, or basically the fate of a person. On this level of meaning, where Thor represents the human being, the so-called wife always represents his fate. What is being said here is that the fate who spins Thor's destiny is not faithful to him. That is, his course of life is destructive and traitorous, and his mother Earth, whom he was born to guard, is dying. He has lost his true purpose. He was supposed to use his strength to protect the earth and to protect humankind, but he has been wasting time fighting his fate and boasting about his manly deeds, and now his mother, the earth, our mother, is dying. Before Thor angrily stomps away, still not really understanding the message, he has the sudden insight to ask the ferryman what he can do in order to get into the land of the gods after all. The ferryman tells him that he will find the way into Odin's land, into the world of the gods, if he only keeps to his path, because then he will be found by his mother, the earth, and she will tell him the way. This is actually reminiscent of a passage in the Rig Veda, from Old India, where it is said, "Crawl you to your mother, the earth, for she will save you from the void." So we are leaving Thor here in a state of anger and on a destructive path, but there is hope. He has finally asked the right question and received valuable counsel. Will he follow that counsel? Okay, just a moment. So, we have reached chapter 11.2, which is Thor in Thrymskvida and Hymiskvida, two different Edda poems. This is also a transcript from the video, the Son of Earth videos I made in the Hidden Knowledge in Old Norse Myths YouTube series. So when I say recently here, that means more than 10 years ago. I recently saw a very good Chinese kung fu movie. It is called Fearless and stars Jet Li, one of my favorite actors. The story is about a young man, Jet Li, who has trained kung fu all his life and is now almost unbeatable. He takes down one champion after the other and is very proud of himself. Yes, he is a great fighter, but there is no wisdom in him. The driving force behind his learning kung fu in the first place is a fear of humiliation and loss, and a need to show them all. He gets into brawls, he drinks, he thinks that winning fame by winning fights is the meaning of life, and therefore what gives him worth. His students are all bullies with his blessing. One day he ends up killing an opponent for a perceived offense, giving in to rage without having investigated the circumstances that led to the fight. It turns out that Jet Li's character was wrong about his opponent and that he has now killed a very honorable man, widowed a very decent woman, and made an innocent child fatherless. Also, there are repercussions, and his own mother and daughter are killed. Jet Li's character almost tries to avenge them before he understands that he himself is to blame. He realizes that he has been incredibly boastful, blind, stupid, ruthless and cruel, and that despite him winning a fight, he has lost his honor and face. Everything in his life falls apart, and he leaves his home and almost dies in the wilderness. However, he is picked up by a humble farmer's family and lives with an old peasant grandmother and her blind daughter for several years, learning to appreciate the earth, humility and simplicity. Through gentleness, he finds his true spiritual strength, which ultimately leads him to become a greater warrior than he was before. When he finally returns, he has truly become a great master who acts with true courage and true fearlessness, for he no longer fears losing, and he has no need to show off for his own sake. He has learned to not abuse the power of his supreme fighting skills. Now, this is a theme that repeats itself in many stories, especially in warrior stories. You have the Karate Kid movies, for example, where the theme is always a young, foolish boy who wishes to learn to fight to get back at his enemies, yet he encounters a wise teacher who, often through humiliation, teaches him to be humble, perceptive, meek, soft, respectful, and invincible. A similar idea is found in Taoism, where it is said that a master of Tao, if he is a man, needs to become like a woman. Not to become a transvestite or anything, but to assume the qualities that are traditionally associated with women: perceptivity, humbleness, meekness, gentleness, weakness. Only with those qualities may Tao enter the body and the mind, and wisdom is born from within. Now, in many shamanistic traditions, a very important part of the initiation is to break down the initiate's pride, boastfulness, and self-importance. You get nowhere, you see, spiritually, through beating your chest. If anyone has read the books of Carlos Castaneda, for example, you may have noticed how much poor Carlos is teased by his teacher and how hard it is for him to let go of his self-importance. However, the teacher says to him that self-importance and self-pity are the greatest obstacles to wisdom and transformation on the path of the spiritual warrior, and this is especially valid for men who are taught and raised to be self-important. And imagine today where everybody are being taught how self-important they should be. I personally have had many teachers, and one of them was a Siberian Tuvan, actually shaman, Nikolai Orsak. I'd learned some throat singing from him. Well, he told me that it is often easier for women to learn and to change because we are more flexible, because we listen more and are more perceptive and humble, and often assume the position of someone who learns. While men often, even without actually knowing so much, often assumes the teaching position because they are very important. The only thing women generally have to work with, he said, is self-confidence. Given that, there is no limit to the speed and efficiency with which a woman can transform into wisdom and light. Men, on the other hand, he said, they often struggle for a lifetime with the obstacles of self-importance, self-pity and boasting. They want to teach before they have learned. They want to beat their chests. They have heavy energies, like Thor, if you recall, from the last chapter. So this shaman told me that the most important and difficult part of learning for men especially is the breakdown of the ego. As far as I have been able to observe the world, I think this could be rather true on a general basis. I think that generally women and men who are on the path of spiritual transformation all struggle with the same things. And that the major difference between women and men is that women struggle with a lack of self-worth, while men struggle with, well, they also struggle with a lack of self-worth, but this real and innermost insecurity is often hidden in men behind thick layers of pride, boasting, and learned self-importance. So this difference may make it somewhat easier for many women to accept that their big problem is low self-esteem, so that they can face this obstacle and deal with it. But it's a lot harder to sort of go down on your self-esteem. Well, as I think I have made clear, this is not a modern phenomenon. You find traditions stressing these same obstacles all over the world and in many indigenous cultures and kung fu movies. Sometimes, often, a prideful man needs to learn humility in order to learn true greatness. Sometimes the higher and more blinding the pride, the greater is the humiliation applied in order to break down the obstacle of self-importance. The moment an ego is broken down, it is easier to access new wisdom. Many shamanistic and other spiritual traditions have developed strong guidelines for how to expose a young man to humiliation in order to teach him humility. So this appears to have also been true of the Norse tradition, in which young men were often met and attacked and taunted, sometimes by monstrous women. This happens a lot in the sagas too. When I did this other lecture series here on Patreon, the Fjölkingi, that has become going to be a book soon, great knowledge, stories of Seiðr and initiation. I went through a lot of saga stories where we see young men who have to go through trials on their paths of initiation. And a lot of these trials involve actually living for a while like a slave, even living like a slave woman sometimes, or only carrying the weapon, like this young guy called Bowie, who for one whole year has to walk around. He's of the class of peasant warrior, so he's supposed to always carry arms, but he has a woman teacher, and he only carries a sling, which in the saga is directly said to be a woman's weapon, and he gets teased a lot for that. And we have lots of stories where they get caught and have to work very hard as herdsmen, like, which was very low. To be a herdsman was a lower status work, often assigned to slaves, but also to young princes who are going through their paths of initiation. And even in Tacitus, going back to 2000 years almost, we find a description where he says that young men actually have to live with slaves and sleep on the floor and live very simple lives until they have proven themselves as warriors. So I think this idea that young men needed to know how young men who were supposed to be warriors, especially nobles, especially princes, these men who were going to have a lot of power, had to sort of experience life from below, either life from the perspective of women, but mostly women were lower ranking, and this is not also. I know we always talk about how women were so strong in the Viking Age, and that's true. Being strong doesn't mean that you have equal rights. Also, having a lot of respect for women, at least for free women. It was a patriarchal society, even so. It was far less misogynistic than later Christian society was, but and there were a lot of things that women could do to avoid the ordinary wife or mostly servant girl function that they had. But so women could definitely have very strong positions, but on the whole, children were named after their fathers. The men were the one who represented the family at the parliament, and basically it wasn't equal. So to be put in the position of a woman was to be put in a position that was lower than the one that a young prince or warrior was supposed to have in his life. So it appears that he would have to see life from the perspective of those who were lower in rank than him, and often even having to live for a while as if they were slaves until they had proven themselves. So that's interesting. I think I'm going to make a more detailed video about this one day. So yeah. Yeah, this appears to have also been true of the Norse tradition, in which young men were often met and attacked and taunted by monstrous women. I think that in macho cultures like the Old Norse, or perhaps in any culture, being taunted and teased by females is a monstrous experience for young men. The grace and fearless acceptance with which the young men met this humiliation determined the outcome and the success of their initiation. They succeed when they handle that treatment and the initial fear with grace, often calling the monster beautiful. They have to call her beautiful, even when she is monstrous. And then seeing how she turns into a helpful creature. In at least one of the stories, the she-monster actually reveals that this was a test that few could pass, and then she turns into a beautiful bride. So, yeah, I want to also add something here that I didn't write there. There is this old Zoroastrian religion text, which was it? I'm going to put the reference into the video later because I don't remember, but it's a story from Persia where this sage, this man, is blessed by Ahura Mazda and is taken into the afterlife world, the place between life and death. And there he meets his Diana. Diana is a Zoroastrian goddess who also represents the soul of a person. So she's both a goddess as such, one of the deities worthy of worship within the Zoroastrian religion, but she also comes as a single individual version for every human being. We all have a Diana, and we meet the Diana when we die. And he meets his Diana, and she's beautiful and fragrant. And when he wanders, she says that I am this way, so beautiful, so fragrant, so attractive, and so she says that she is all these good things because he is good. She is a reflection of him. Because she is his Diana, she represents his fate, his soul, and the degree to which she is beautiful is a direct reflection of his worth. And he goes into the underworld, in the darker places, where he sees another man who has died, but he also meets his Diana, but then the Diana is an old, ugly, ill-smelling crone who just shrieks at him, and she says that I am this way because you are a bad person. And this is a sort of philosophy, a religious philosophy that is related to the Old Norse. I think that these when these gods and men meet these supernatural women who look ugly to begin with, but then when they change and make the right choices, they turn into beautiful women. I think it's about the same concept as we find in the concept of the Diana. Now, anyway, getting back to Thor. You may now understand where I am going. In the last video, the son of Earth encountered a teacher. The last chapter, the son of Earth encountered a teacher who showed him that no matter how heroic and strong and invincible a warrior he was, he could not get into the divine realms by boasting of that. He is humiliated and he is ridiculed and told that his course of action is wrong. While Odin met these playful, beautiful, although non-compliant women, Thor was struggling with she-wolves who attacked the fortress, the ship that he had built so well, who attacked his paradigms of beliefs, chasing away everything that holds things together, Chalfi, Thor's servants. And we are told how Thor reacted with rage and anger rather than with learning. The fact that the women wore wolf cloth signifies death. The death of his ego, perhaps, which, if he had accepted it, would have led him to discover the beautiful bride that these women really are. Sadly, Thor's encounter with the she-wolves is a test that Thor witlessly fails, because he is so eager to defend the mental system that he had worked so hard to build. It all sounds very familiar. A similar myth is told by Snorri, actually. In that story, Thor goes to Utgarder, to the outer world, and tries to act a big man, only to be shown time and time again how small and insignificant he really is among the real powers of the universe. So it is a long story, so I won't retell it here, but it is available in the Prose Edda. I think I'm going to do some more work on that one after I finish this reading project, actually. In the last video, I told you how Thor, in the Ljod poem, finally had the wits to ask how he would be able to reach the divine lands. And he was told that he had to follow the path, the left-hand path even, to that land until he was found by his mother, the earth, and that she would help him to find the way. And off he stomped, not quite believing this. However, something obviously gave. It took some time though. In the next poem about Thor, we learn how he wakes up one morning and realizes that he has lost his hammer. This is the Thrymskvida. I'm going to cite the beginning line of that poem, the Thrymskvida, in Old Norse, just because it is so beautiful. Reider var då Thor, han vaknade, och sins hamars saknade. Angry was friendly Thor when he awoke and missed his hammer. Thor immediately seeks the great shaman of the gods, Loki. We tend to think of Loki as the bad guy, but the truth is that he is just rather complicated, like any human being is. Loki, more than willing to serve Thor, immediately goes to Freya, the great goddess of shamans, and asks if she will kindly lend him her falcon hide. Freya kvad, då mynda ek gefader, þott ur gulli veri, och då sälja att veri ur silfri. Freya said, I would have given it to you, even if it had been made out of gold, even if it were made out of silver. So she lends him her falcon falcon hide, which is actually called a valshammer, which means a death hide. Loki flies off in Freya's death hide, the falcon hide, until he comes to the world of the giants, to be exact, the world of Thrymr, whose name actually means something like to drum, from thruma, drumming, making a steady beat. There are some shamanistic aspects here, as you see. Drumming, shape-changing, going into other worlds to seek answers. The giant Thrymr, the drumming one, says that he has got the hammer of Thor and that he will return it to the Aesir, but only if the gods bring him the goddess Freya as a wife. And Loki returns with the message, and Thor, thoughtlessly, runs to Freya and tells her to get ready for the marriage with the giant, upon which the goddess displays her independence and her power and makes the whole earth shake with her rage. In short, she blankly refuses. And here we have a verse that is a bit similar to when Thor got angry in the beginning. Reider var då Thor, han vaknade, och sins hamars saknade. So, and here we have Freyja. Reid var då Freyja och fnasade aller åsa saler under biftis. Stauk that ik mikla med en brisinga. Mikveis du verda veigar nasta ef ek med ver I Jötunheima. Angry was Freyja, and she snorted, so that the entire hall of the gods trembled from beneath, and her powerful jewel of flames burst. You must think I was desperate for a man if I was to go with you to the giant world, she says, and flatly refuses. So note that Freyja's anger in the first line of the stanza is described exactly like Thor's, making an intentional rhyme with the poem's opening line. Reider var då Vingthor, han vaknade. Reider var då Freyja och fnasade. A point has been made in Freyja's two reactions to two different requests. Freyja represents soul, light, and wisdom, immortality even. The soul, light, and wisdom is happy when someone wishes to seek knowledge, like Loki did when he asked to borrow her death hide, her falcon hide. But she gets angry, however, when someone wishes to marry her off to the forces of destruction and greed. This too is a metaphor. Then all the gods gather in parliament. It is of vital importance that Thor retrieves his hammer, because this is necessary in order to defend the earth and the gods from the destructive forces of the outer world. The wise god, Heimdallr, who represents the universe, well, he suggests that Thor dress up like a bride himself in order to trick the giant Thrymr into giving him his hammer back. Thor protests, claiming that the Aesir will laugh at him and call him unmanly and shamed if he dresses up like a woman. However, Loki then intervenes and tells him that he must do what is needed and not think about his male pride before the welfare of the gods. Thor has to accept. Loki, well, he doesn't have a problem with cross-dressing, so he happily offers to show up too as a bridesmaid, and he helps Thor to dress up like a bride, like a maiden. Then, both being in the appearance of women, the two of them, Loki and Thor, they often go together. They go to the world of the drum in the shapes of a bride and her handmaiden. And at the wedding, the giant places Thor's hammer in the bride's lap in order to seal the marriage, a rather symbolic act. In fact, the groom placing a Thor's hammer in the bride's lap symbolizes penetration. And to Thor, who is known as the sort of manly god, even the symbolic act of being penetrated by another male is a moment of utter emasculation and thus humiliation. However, it is in this moment of humiliation, when the hammer is placed in his lap, as if he was a bride, that Thor throws his head back and laughs. He laughs because he realizes that it is now that he is retrieving his true power. He seizes his hammer, kills the giant and the giant's sister who had asked him for his red rings. The sister symbolizes old age and death, the sister of the giant, and the red rings symbolize life, so this means that Thor manages to conquer death. So I see this in connection with the first story. Thor failed the first test of initiation because he started to fight the she-wolf witches who attacked his masculine ego paradigm and his self-image. Then a new and even more humiliating test is presented to him, in which he himself has to assume the role of a woman. And in this context, we should say a couple of things about Old Norse pagan attitudes towards gender roles. At first sight, Old Norse society was obviously patriarchal and strictly gender divided. Women were highly respected for wisdom and medicine skills, and actually in many ways ruled the economy, but men ruled the spheres of politics and war, and there were strict codes of masculine honor. Homosexuality appears to have been quite acceptable behavior within certain limits. Yes, it was. Of that there is ample evidence. Yet there are quite a number of examples from Old Norse texts where men who had been lovers before argue in public for all to hear about it, about who had played the active, masculine, penetrating part. And what can we learn from that? Well, we learn that the Norsemen who had sex with other men could be open about it and feel no shame, but that they would feel embarrassed if people thought that they had been the femme in the relationship. They were not persecuted for it. They were not attacked. There was no punishment. Obviously, homosexuality was one of those things that happened and that people knew about. But if the man in question was a high-ranking man, a warrior, one of those fierce Vikings, his manliness could be doubted. And if there was a rumor that he had been the passive, receptive part of the act, this could be a source of amusement, and it could be used to tease and taunt and to cause dishonor. And the first earliest law text we have shows that it is actually illegal to insult a man by suggesting that he had been the passive recipient in a homosexual relationship. If you said that about or to another man, you could actually be legally killed. So, and that's interesting, because the text doesn't say that you actually can get legally killed if you have sex with another of the same gender. It says that if you tease someone about it, you could get killed. Interesting. What about cross-dressing? Well, the fact is that there is plenty of evidence from archaeology that some sort of transgender behavior happened and was recognized. Acknowledged behavior with a place of its very own within an otherwise rather gender-divided Norse pagan society. They even seem to have had a title reserved for male to female transsexuals, and that was Seiðr, which means a womb by Seiðr. That is a sort of magical womb, a magical vagina. And this title appears to have been applied to male practitioners, or biologically male practitioners, people who had gained a womb by Seiðr. And we don't know exactly what this means and how common it was, but we know that it happened, and that people who in some way or other were gender non-conforming could be buried with all honors with the preferred equipment. So sometimes we find graves that we thought were the graves before. We thought it was a male grave, or we thought it was a female grave, and then because of DNA we discovered that it was the opposite way around, and that means that some people were buried with a set of equipment that belonged to a different gender than the one that you can find in the DNA, basically. So yeah. There is plenty of evidence from archaeology that some sort of transgender behavior could happen and was recognized and acknowledged behavior. Transgender behavior and lifestyles happened, and it seems to have happened within the contexts of shamanism, ritual and religion. An example of this is the infamous Ragnvalder feminine yielding legs, Rettilbeini, son of King Haraldur Hårfagri, who went openly and proudly by his rather suggestive nickname, yet wielded great political power and held his father's trust until a certain point where Haraldur became suspicious about the sorcery practiced by Ragnvalder and his Sami mother. Ragnvalder, son of Harald Hairfair and a Sami princess, was a powerful side man with a very kinky nickname and gender-defiant nickname. Norse Viking Age society was a society with clear-cut gender roles, but without church doctrines and sexual morals. When children emerged who clearly did not fit into the expected gender roles, it appears that they were not considered freaks or anything. It appears that they were more likely to be considered magical and sent off to learn magic. So it was a sign of sign of some divine or spiritual or magical fate when someone had a different gender than the one they had at birth, they were born with. Some boys returned from their initiations with so-called magical wombs, and apparently there was a space for them in Norse society. Only later on, when Christian descendants wrote down the lore of their Norse pagan ancestors, did they feel a certain embarrassment about these facts, and wrote that there were aspects about ancestral customs that were sexually perverted. Archaeology, however, shows that these special people were acknowledged as and buried as their gender that they identified with, as recently argued by the Norwegian archaeologist Britt Solli. Well, recently, that's 10 years ago now, but it's still a good point. So I think that Thor's trial of cross-dressing, which to him, the manly god, was a tremendously difficult trial, is an example of what is amply documented from the Norse material, namely that cross-dressing and transgender often took place in ritual contexts, even for those who usually fitted into the norm of male-female polarity. The second poem of Helgi Hunningsbani describes how the high-born prince Helgi lives for a time in secret among his enemies, disguised as a female servant, actually as a woman slave. And those who comment on him believe that he is a manly woman who would be better off as a female warrior. They even argue why this woman should have been a warrior. So apparently if people showed signs of the opposite gender roles, they may not have been actually discouraged as much as later. It actually might have been, people might have thought, okay, that's unusual, but she should be a warrior. She should take this education. And a very feminine boy might be sent to learn sorcery. So, like, they had spaces, even if they were more flexible than people got later, I think. Anyway, those who comment on him in this state believe that he is a manly woman who would be better off as a female warrior. The poem later relates how the sorcerer Sinfjötli is castrated and how he openly argues with his ex-lover Gudmundur about which of them was the masculine part of their relationship. One of Odin's name is Hjalk, which means the gelding, the castrate. In the Lokasenna, Odin is said to have lived as a völva and done sexually dishonorable things best not mentioned. That best not mentioned part is probably put in by those who wrote down the poem. So why? So I think that in a society where gender differences are the norm, transgender aspects is potentially a very powerful transformative experience. The more unthinkable it is to act like the opposite gender, the more effect such an act will have on the mind. When a society makes gender into such a big issue as it was in the Norse world, the application of the role of the other gender could be a deeply transformative experience. Everything you thought you knew about yourself would disappear. Anyone who ever tried to be the opposite of what they thought they were knows what a great mind-opening power there is in this. And this is possibly a reason why the technique of assuming the exact opposite or very different social position was applied in many ancient traditions. It was a way of opening up the mind and the soul. So obviously this is another and more complete storytelling, the same tale. At initiation, there is a very important paradox, the need to let go of pride and self-importance, of the male ego even, if one is to retrieve one's true lost potential, one's true power. In another story told by Snorri, Thor is challenged by the giants to come and visit them without all of his weapons and his gear. As we know, Thor has a power belt, 2 iron gloves, and a hammer that represents lightning, perhaps even electricity, and that is also symbolic of power and manliness. He often fights giantesses who hurl rocks towards Middle-earth, and a giantess representing death and old age is his sworn enemy, one he always tries to conquer. However, in this story he must show his true courage by walking unprotected into the giant world without his iron gloves, without his hammer, and without his power belt. He's completely weaponless. And suddenly it occurs to him to seek the aid of his old enemies. He seeks the cave of a giantess called Gridr. Her name, Gridr, means truce, which tells a lot, and she is the mother of Odin's son, Vidar, Vidar the Silent. Vidar means perhaps to expand and to widen out. It gives me at least an association to the expansion of the mind and the spirit when inner silence is achieved. In fact, I think that this might be what Vidar the Silent represents. He is one of those gods that only appears in poetry, a pure metaphor for silent expansion of spirit, and that Gridr, by being his metaphorical mother, is the one who helps to give birth to this state of consciousness. Thor spends some time with the giantess in the cave, where she teaches him how to conquer his enemy. The enemy is the giant Red Spear and his daughters, who literally urinate the waters of death, in which Thor later almost drowns. Red Spear, of course, is another metaphor for death. I analyze this story as such, that the giantess, representing a wise woman or witch, and also representing the earth, because the earth is a giantess, and as you know, Thor was told to let earth show him the way to the spirit lands. So this is what happens, and when Thor has finished his apprenticeship with the giantess, she lends him her power wand, indicating that she is a witch indeed. It's the Gridar Völer. It's a Völer just like the one that the Völer had. And she lends this Völ to him, so that he suddenly uses a Völvas weapon. And with this Gridar Völer, the wand of the giantess, comes a power belt and iron gloves, so that the Völir, this staff, this magical staff, this wand of the Völva, can be used exactly like the hammer of Thor. He uses the power belt and the iron gloves to use this Völir, a woman's staff of office, used exactly like as if it was his own hammer. So, in this way, Thor is again armed, only this time with the weapons of the old lady, representing wisdom perhaps, and needless to say, he wins the battle eventually, with the equipment of this woman who taught him. So we have a common thread between the various Thor myths here. In the last video, Thor was told to seek out his Mother Earth for guidance. In another story, a giantess in a cave, who could very well represent the earth, offers him guidance, and he conquers death. In 2 stories now, Thor has had to give up his attributes, his hammer and his manhood, in order to succeed. In one, he had to become humble like a maiden bride. In another, he had to go unprotected and weaponless and apply the weapons of an old woman, a witch. It is all about letting down the guard of self-importance and discover one's true courage behind the mask and the role. In a 3rd story, Thor becomes a young boy in order to complete his task. That story is the Hymis Quida, the Song of Hymn, a giant of frost. That story begins with another giant, Aegir. Aegir is the father of the 9 giantesses who gave birth to the universe and who manifests as light or waves. And he is husband to Ran, who receives the dead in her net. He lives on the island called Hlesøy, the wind-shielded island. We have been talking about that place a few times now, and basically this is the island of immortality associated with the cosmic ocean below the world tree, an ocean that provides the water to the 3 cosmic wells, the well of memory, the well of fate, and the well of death and renewal. All of them basically are the same well. Aegir, who then lords over the immortal realms, invites the gods to a party there. Now remember one thing, the gods, the Norse gods, the Aesir, were not immortal. They were completely dependent on the goddess Idun, the aspect of the great goddess that offers the apples of eternal resurrection. Every year the gods have to eat these apples and will grow old and die unless she is there to offer her fruits to them. Thus the gods live long through the help of this lady, but they are not immortal. So being invited to the island of immortality is a big thing for them. But in order to get there and party, they have to bring a cauldron that is big enough to hold all the mead of Aegir. And this task falls on Thor, who, accompanied by the god of war, Tyr, travels to the outer world of the giants. In the outer world realm, a giant called Hymir, which means hymn, a sort of song, is a frost giant, and he owns a cauldron that is of the appropriate enormous size. When Thor and Tyr arrive in his halls, they are lucky to find that the giant is out for the day. However, someone else is there, Thor's maternal grandmother, and she is a scary one. The poems tell, to the lad, grandmother was fierce to behold. 900 heads the old one had. But another came forward, all bright and golden. Bright-browed, she offered strong drink to her son. And she is called Modir, the mother. Now we know that Thor's mother is the earth, so the golden friendly woman called Modir is probably actually his mother, the earth, the very person he was told to seek out for help and guidance. And she gives it. We know that Earth's mother is Nøttur, which means night, a terrifying giantess, which, as it is said, 900 heads. The theme is one of endless repetition in Norse law. We have by now seen countless stories in which the hero of the initiation stories is met with a horrible ogress and a beautiful woman. Sometimes the two are just aspects of the same person. It is the life versus death contradiction. In any case, as the gods do not let themselves become too terrified of the ogress, the beautiful and benevolent maiden aspect appears and offers strong beer, a symbol of the initiation. She also offers counsel, and because of her advice and warnings, Thor manages to conquer the giant Hymir. In the same story, Thor also goes on a fishing trip and almost catches the middle-world serpent. Famous story, full of meaning. I cannot go into every detail about the Thor mythology here, it is too much, so let us stay with this particular common thread of essentials. With the help of his mother, the Earth, who he was taught to seek for help earlier in the Hyndluljóð, Thor manages to outwit Hymir, puts the cauldron over his head so that it covers his entire body, a metaphor for something, obviously, and with this cauldron covering his entire body, he runs off and gets away from Hymir. As a result of his success, he is able to reach the island of immortality and let the gods drink the mead of memory, wisdom, and resurrection. He also manages to retrieve his wife. Remember how Odin mocked Thor because his wife Sif was being unfaithful. Actually, it turned out that the lady had only tried to help Loki, offering him the mead of the gods with the hope that he should calm down. But the god of jealousy and intrigue abuses the gift. That, however, is a different story. The most important thing is that Thor, at the Island of Immortality, takes his wife back, and thus his own fate back. Through trials harsher to him than any giant opponent, trials that require him to let go of his pride, his boastfulness, his masculinity, his protection, his very identity. They are trials that require him to seek guidance from women, even from the women who used to be his enemies. And even through all this humiliation, he finally retrieves all his powers and reaches the Island of Immortality with a cauldron that covers his entire body and which can hold all the mead of immortality. The last part of this chapter is 11.3, Thor and the Mind, a personal revelation. And here, this is also a transcript from YouTube video in the Hidden Knowledge series, YouTube video 21, the Thundergod's Maze. And I am going to render that old video as it was. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I have received so much feedback lately, and I'm glad and honored and grateful that so many different people seem to enjoy and learn from my lectures. So thank you all for letting me know and for asking interesting questions. I don't always get to reply, that's just how it is, but you are appreciated. I would like to say that I believe that these myths are a world heritage, one culture's expression of a very ancient and pan-human spiritual path. Like Stonehenge and the Sphinx and the Vedas, it belongs to all of us. There was one who said to me that he thought that my analysis of the Trimskvida, the story I told in the last video where Thor had to play the bride, he thought that it was a lot more credible that this story was about initiation and learning than an actual attempt to mock the god Thor, which is the official analysis given in any mainstream textbook. It is also how I was taught as a child, that the Norse religion was no real religion, that they didn't even really take their gods seriously. So thank you, Michael, for perceiving that difference in the way I handle the Thor lore and for reminding me of an interesting subject. What was the Norse people's relationship to their gods? As I've made clear, the Norse pagan lore of the great, very popular and ancient god Thor actually gives the impression that this god is ridiculed and humiliated. But is he really? My analysis offers a reason for why this is the case, because Thor in the myths represents mankind and man's quest for wisdom, and honestly relates all the pitfalls and blind spots that may be encountered on the way. Maybe Thor is not ridiculed at all. Maybe he's rather honored for having paved the way for others to follow, and for letting all the aspect of his experience be a map. Especially when it involves less flattering tales. To openly relate for the sake of learning or teaching, and in retrospect and laugh at one's own stupidities in the past, yet stupidities that were overcome, is not a sign of weakness, as I'm sure Thor would be the first to point out. It is a sign of real greatness. So, I respect the faith of people, and I don't want to bash Christians or Muslims or Jews for that matter. I'm fully aware that any one individual's personal relationship to their God is varied, and that any religion may have room for real spiritual insights and the evolvement of the soul. I also happen to think that Norse mythology is not the only mythology where it would be fruitful to apply a metaphorical and allegorical understanding. I think that the Bible, for example, could also be read in this way, and there have been some attempts to do that. But these monotheist religions have sort of been, in my opinion, hijacked by powerful political institutions such as the church, and as such they have developed doctrines that tend to offer an image of God that is not necessarily the only way to perceive divinity, although these religious institutions claim that theirs is the only way. In these institutional faiths, God has become someone up there, far away from here, above, outside of creation, better than us, higher than us, a million times more sacred than us, and we, his creatures, are lowly and bad and sinful and shameful, and our only hope is that God will have mercy on us despite all our lowliness, and for this purpose we are supposed to kneel and bow and beg and pray and display our utter submission and declare our uselessness and our guilt and so on. And this has, to an overwhelming degree, been the effect of the totalitarian institutionalized religion, no matter what the real and originally spiritual message was really about. And obviously, in this setting, there is no room for making fun of God at all. That is blasphemy, that is sacrilege, and if those institutions get their will, making fun of God will be severely punished. And since this has been the way of people for some time now, it can be difficult to understand a previous tradition, a pagan tradition in which the gods are the object of funny stories and engage in all kinds of activities, even sex. It is easy when you think that God has to be an angry and humorless and strict old man with jealousy and supremacy issues to think that the Old Norse religion was no religion at all, obviously, since their gods were more fun. This is actually the subject of one poem of the Poetic Edda, which is known as the Lokasenna, meaning Loki's mocking. In this poem, all the gods and goddesses have gathered together with the immortal light elves in the hall of Aegir. The 9 daughters of Aegir function as their light, and the gods try to entertain the old giant, while they wait for Thor to arrive with the cauldron of Hymir, which we talked about in the last video. And while they're waiting, Loki, the blood brother of Odin and the constant companion of Thor, arrives late and drunk, and he kills the 2 servants of the gods called Fimafengr and Eldi, and those names mean cleverness and maturity. And that is obviously a metaphor, because after having killed these aspects of intelligence and wisdom within himself, Loki then approaches the gathering of the gods and angrily starts to accuse them of all kinds of lowly behavior. Basically, the goddesses are accused of having immoral and casual sex outside of marriage, whereas the gods are accused of unmanly behavior and cowardice. And this poem, where the gods are criticized, has been taken as yet another example of how empty the pagan religion was. What most people have not really paid attention to when analyzing this poem, however, is that the gods do not attempt to deny the accusations, but they do stand forward, one after the other, and try to explain to Loki that he has not understood the real meaning behind these stories. And the result of his failure to understand the deeper meaning of the divine actions is devastating for Loki, because when Thor returns with a cauldron of wisdom that covers the totality of his being, Loki is expelled and ends up suffering terribly from the poison that he has created. I can go more in detail on this poem at a later stage, because this is not the subject today. So, what kind of religion was Norse paganism? Well, when Christianity was introduced, people at first made a distinction between the new religion, which they called Kristindomur, the rule of Christ, and the old pagan religion, which they called Heidindomur, the rule of Hyndluljóð. The word Heidindomur is derived from the word Heiðr, which means brightness or heath, and which, by the way, was a common name for witches, And it was the name that Freya wore when she walked the earth at the dawn of time and taught the art of Seiðr to human beings and the gods. I think that's interesting. But the term Heidindómur is usually understood as referring to the fact that this religion was usually practiced outside, in groves, in mountains and on heaths. Later, when most people had adapted to the new faith, the old faith was remembered as Fornseder, the old custom. I think that there was a great degree of flexibility in this religion. They were pragmatic people. They had an acute awareness of the universe as something highly mysterious, something even the gods had not fully grasped. The great god of wisdom, Odin, does not stand out as a know-it-all. He stands out as a seeker of wisdom, one who never stops learning. Curiosity and openness of mind was the essence of wisdom. In the myths, Odin is learning, Thor is learning, Freyr is learning. This religion was not based on set doctrines. It was based on mystical experience and a consciousness about how knowledge always develops. Okay, so I'm going to tell you 2 stories about mystical experiences that I've had in relation to Thor. And let me first emphasize the fact that I do have an academic background as an historian and an academic approach to the mythology. I always consider the evidence and check my conclusions again and again and change it if necessary. And check it with other scientists. But however, there have been times when I have felt that dreams and visions have actually helped me to a deeper understanding or have pointed out the way for me. And I cannot say whether this is just my subconscious working on material that I didn't manage to figure out in an ordinary state of mind, or if the powers really give me messages or whatever. I don't know. And that really depends on what you are inclined to believe, and it doesn't really matter to me as long as it works. So I will just tell you the story. Okay, so I was about 14 years... it was about 14 years ago. I was not 14, I was in my early 20s. And I was living in England, and I had just begun to seriously study the Edda. I had a very good Japanese friend, and she suggested that we take a short holiday in York together, and I said yeah, sure, and tagged along. I didn't know anything about York at the time. I did not know that York was an ancient Viking town, nor that it was famous for its ghost sightings. There is possibly no place on earth where ghost sightings are more common than York. People who never really believed in or thought they would see ghosts have reported seeing ghosts in York. They even have a museum about ghosts in York. I didn't know this, but the moment I entered within the city walls, I felt like, wow, it's like this place has no real time, as if time is blurred together. I don't think everybody feel that way in York, but I did, and I kept looking over my shoulders, and I felt I kept seeing these historical scenes and images, and it was like time just became relative, and it was very, very odd. It made me very alert and nervous, edgy. We had arrived quite late, so the only thing we did that evening was to eat and have a half pint of Guinness in a local pub, and because the next day we were going to go do sketching and visit museums and stuff. So when I went to bed in the B&B, I still had no idea about the Viking past or about the apparent ghost presence in York. I fell asleep almost immediately, and then I dreamt. I dreamt of flying through York, looking for something that was hidden. It was a starlit night, and well, the moon was dark, but it was lit up by stars, and I flew and searched all over the place, circling the city walls, and then finally I found and realized what I was looking for. It was an ancient temple dedicated to the Old Norse god Thor. And the temple was hidden below the ground, but as I recognized it, the temple surfaced, revealing itself to having been built in stone in the shape of a maze, a round maze. And I heard in my head a woman's voice say, "This is Thor's sanctuary, and you will be initiated. Do you consent?" And I went, okay. And then I felt this pull towards the labyrinth. So I entered the labyrinth, flying just above ground level, and as I kept moving through the maze, it was like a little bit spirally, and my body was gradually disintegrating, beginning with my feet, and then my legs, and then most parts of my torso. And at some point I only had my head and shoulders and arms left, and I knew that these two would disintegrate if I continued into the maze. And the more I disintegrated, the brighter everything was becoming. By the time that I was disappearing, there was daylight in my dream, and I could see a huge green oak tree standing majestically in the center of the labyrinth. And as I felt myself disappearing, I tried desperately to hang on to something, and I grasped in the air with no arms to grasp with, really, and I called my heart, my center, and I heard in my dream a woman's voice saying, "Thor is protection." And I woke up, I thought, with a beating heart and her words still ringing in my ears. But my trials were not over. I was catching my breath and trying to feel whether I still had a body. And then I felt something standing beside my bed, just behind my own back. And I felt my hairs rise and a cold shiver running down my spine, because it was a black shadow. I sensed that it was a black shadow that I had sensed earlier in the day, one of those things that had made me feel edgy and nervous. And I lay still for a while, hoping that it would go away if I ignored it and pretended that it wasn't there, but it didn't. Its oppressive energy was right there behind me, intent on me, focused on me, and it didn't feel reassuring. And I knew I would have to face it, so I turned around slowly and felt myself freeze with terror as I saw it. The ghost was it was a huge, dark figure clad in a black mantle and looking perhaps like a medieval monk, or rather, because of the sword it was holding, like some ancient warrior. And he held his sword with both hands, pointing it towards the ground, and he just stared at me. And I could not see his face, it was shadowed by his hood, and but I could feel his icy stare piercing right through me. And then I felt angry. And when I now say that I talked to him and even screamed at him, I didn't do so physically. My body was frozen, motionless, staring at the ghost. And perhaps I was sleeping and it was a nightmare, but it felt very real, and I remember it very clearly. Some part of me that was like myself in a dream rose up from my body and screamed anyway. And what I was screaming surprised me, because I had never before then thought of myself as a witch. Never. But there I was, and I was screaming, "How dare you! I'm a witch! I'm a witch, and I do not fear you!" Some part of my mind reacted to what I was saying with puzzlement. I'm a witch? Well, that was what I was screaming, very assertively, out loud with my dreaming body. "I'm a witch, you bastard! Get the hell out of here, you do not belong in this room." And the ghost just remained there, staring at me as if daring me to prove my point, that I was a witch and that I was more powerful than him. And he seemed to be mocking me and laughing at me, and I could see his hands clutching his sword more tightly. And my thoughts raced through my brain until I remembered those words, "Thor is protection." And then I just called him. I invoked the god. I heard myself screaming at the top of my dreaming lungs, summoning Thor for my protection. And then I felt a strange surge explode in my body, and then I felt and saw this dark, reddish, thundering figure with eyes like glowing embers emerge from my own belly. Tall, huge, powerful, and majestic. And he was wielding a weapon, and as he emerged, I could see the ghost actually take a step back. And then Thor suddenly became like a black and red wall of impenetrable energy around the bed, surrounding me like a fortress against the black shadow ghost. And you know how sometimes the mind just works very quickly, especially in dreams. And you can have a series of revelations and insights and feelings in very, very short time. Well, I had these insights. 1. This thundering, impenetrable, protective, massive, static, holding energy was the essence of Thor as a cosmic power. 2. It was also the essence of masculinity, of masculine energy. And 3. This Thor energy, this masculine energy, was, by protecting me, serving its true purpose. And at that realization I had a pang of grief, because as a woman on this planet, and this is valid for women all around the globe, it has for much too long been a matter of life and death that we are cautious around men. Because men may potentially be dangerous and harmful to us. Men may violate us and abduct us and use us and objectify us and imprison us and sell us and buy us and trick us and condemn us and punish us. And this awareness has been engraved into our hearts as an age-old truth, a matter of survival. Even the men that were closest to us could not automatically be relied on. The concept of relying on men for support and protection so that we may relax and concentrate on developing and teaching our wisdom to the children and nurture them with our love, that concept became empty a long time ago. It became a bad deal for us. Those who were supposed to support us turned against us, and the wall of protection became prisons. I realized how much I missed real men, real brothers. And it was as if our brothers had been lost in some sort of violence and supremacy psychosis. And I realized why the goddess weeps. All over the world the goddess weeps, and in Norse myths the goddess Freya weeps her golden tears because of the loss of poetry, the loss of spirit, and the loss of the sacred union and true partnership. And well, as these thoughts and emotions ran through me, I also made another observation, that this energy, this essence of masculinity, had emerged from within me. And that was almost incredible, because I didn't think that I didn't ever think that I possessed that kind of energy in me. And I looked at it and I knew that even though it came from me or through me, and that I was using it in some way, it was still the opposite of me. And that led me to the ultimate question: what am I then? What is my power? If this is the god, what is the goddess? And then she came, but not in any way I had ever experienced or imagined before. She came like the Thor force from within me, as a very real force of energy shooting through my body like lightning. And I didn't know that what Kundalini Shakti was then, but in retrospect I'm sure that I had my first encounter with that particular serpentine energy, because it emerged from my root, from my womb, and then moved up my spine in the shape of a double helix until it reached my head, which it simply blew open. And my head was open, and a stream of blue electric energy that seemed to be shooting out of me like a fountain. And it was the first time I experienced the goddess as something more than mild and blissful love. And I knew that this was the true power of the goddess, that this was what she really was. And as this immense power was contained within the walls of Thor, it started to circuit. I could feel my body suddenly give a jolt as the blue serpentine lightning spiraled itself down through my body and out through my feet. And as soon as it had moved through me, it encountered the walls of Thor, turned and moved back into my feet and moved up again. And then she kept like spiraling her way up and down through my body and out through my head and back, until I felt utterly, completely charged with electrical power that filled all my veins. And then I felt myself rising again, hovering above the wall and telling the ghost that he should be gone, because I was a witch and this was my power and I would wield it against him. And finally the ghost vanished. And then I felt the wall of protection that had been Thor descend back into my belly. And then I felt the lady gradually retire into my womb. Although I felt her electrical energy sizzle through me all night, and I felt that for several days afterwards. I felt charged and wide open. And I was not surprised the day after to learn that York was an old Viking town and a ghost town. But I was very disappointed to learn that there was no known temple of Thor, because I was certain that it must be there. I wanted to go and sort of give my thanks. But as far as we know, it's not physically there. I'm sort of still expecting some kind of archaeological discovery, but well, anyway. Instead, I spent the whole day walking around the entire city wall as a sort of homage. Now, this experience helped me in my research on Thor lore. A lot of my personal experience seemed to be highly compatible with the mythology, and in my second video in this series, I talked about how Thor lore seemed to reflect some ancient understanding of electricity conduction and the electromagnetic field around Earth, of polar opposites coming together to create tremendous power. And all that were things that I started to realize after this experience. And I found that I could scientifically argue most of the aspects of my understanding of Thor. Sadly, we know so little about Thor's wife Seiðr that I have to admit that my interpretation of her as being the lightning and the electrical power is based on some evidence and on reasonable deduction, but still the evidence is uncertain. It's not an incredible thesis, but it's impossible to prove with scientific certainty. But on a personal level, I am certain, and that certainty is based on my personal mystical revelation. And I'm also certain that my kind of experience was of the type that the ancients would induce on a regular basis. And that also led me to think that things in mythology are not always what they seem at first sight. Okay. Second story. Many years later, I had begun my first attempt to write a book on Norse mythology, and I struggled a bit with Thor. I had the electrical conduction theory going, but there was so much more to the lore of Thor. And then one night, after having spent the whole day reading through all the Thor lore of the Eddas, I dreamt. In this dream, I was suddenly before the great pagan temple of Uppsala in Sweden. And it was the Viking Age, and I knew that there would be a Thor statue inside the temple. So I went inside, and I was met by an old woman who looked very much like a witch, with a staff and all. And I asked if I could see Thor, since I had something to ask him. And she sort of stepped aside and made a gesture, and there I suddenly saw this middle-aged huge warrior standing there. His hair and beard was red, and his eyes were like ember lights. And I stared at him, and he stared back. And suddenly I felt a thought emerging from his forehead enter my forehead like an electrical jolt. And the thought he sent me consisted of 3 sentences. Thought is electricity. Mind is the conductor. I am the conductor. And I woke up, and it was like everything suddenly came into place. I had to sort of grab my laptop and start writing, and I kept writing until the morning. And when I later in the day looked at my notes, everything I had written as if in trance during the night made sense. And it opened up an entirely new realm of my understanding of the myths. And it began with a certain knowledge that on one important metaphorical level, Thor represents the human mind, the conductor and filter of thought. In the next video, I will present the analysis that I made on the Trinity of gods inspired by that particular insight. For today, I wish to sum up and conclude the story of Thor's initiation. We have seen how his journey started when he wanted to get into the land of the gods and realized that for all his manly deeds, he could not enter. He was told to seek the guidance of his mother, the earth. and that if he did not succeed, she would die. And as we know, Thor's major purpose is to protect the earth, the mother, and Midgard, the world. At first he failed. As he tried to enter the island of immortality, he refused to let go of his preconceptions and his pride, and started to batter the women who tried to teach him. Then he was presented with a bigger trial still, the loss of his hammer and the adoption of a feminine role, his polar opposite. And as he became the opposite of himself, he was able to grasp the power, and now he was on his way. The next step was to dare to lay aside all the weapons and all his protection and walk unprotected into the unknown. Wise enough to seek the guidance of the mother giantess, he is given her ancient weapons and manages to win the second trial. The third step was to become like a young child again, entering the unknown. First, he is faced with the terrifying aspect of the feminine power, the giant ogress grandmother with 900 heads. But as he stands his ground and does not let fear take him, the gentle, guiding, teaching aspect of the feminine steps forth and offers him strength and advice. Then he manages to trick the frost giant, who freezes everything and makes an effort to fish the world serpent and gets to look the serpent in the eye. And one stop here. Midgard, the middle world, is the earth, or the human world, that Thor protects against the onslaughts of Utgard, the outer world. But to every macrocosmos there is a microcosmos, and on the micro level, the middle world is human consciousness, the known. Because if you think of Thor as a metaphor for the mind, the human mind, then the world he protects is the consciousness, human awareness, what we know. And we know that the conscious mind is like a filter that puts all the impressions and thoughts and feelings that we experience into a certain order. That order is something we have learned, and it's often strongly cultural and becomes a framework of preconceptions by which we understand the world. And to protect that order, everything that does not fit into the framework is expelled or ignored. And if something really tries to get in very strongly but which does not fit into our preconceptions, we will often react with anger, like Thor reacted when giantesses reminded him of his mortality before he understood that he could learn from that. So, if we take this approach, we may reconsider the middle world serpent. That serpent, which has more than one name. In one poem he is called Fafnir, the embracer, and he embraces the known world, forms a border against the unknown. He is the limitation of the human mind, a limitation against which Thor, the mind, has to fight. It is when Thor lifts the veil that is the serpent of limitation, of illusion perhaps, that he sees it in the eye, and sees his world start to tremble. It is when the known and the unknown meets that Thor can finally receive new knowledge. This is the point where he gathers the courage to steal the cauldron of knowledge and let it cover the totality of his being, so that he may arrive victorious to the banquet of the immortals. That's it for today. Okay, see you.